these brothers, all the girls loved them. They were good looking. They were good at basketball. I remember I took a charge once. One of them drove right into me, and he was just like, they were all that. They were just all that.
Hi, welcome to Moving to a New Place, a podcast on faith, race, and all things in between. My name is Dalton Holloway. Also on the podcast, Mike Lennon, proud father of 2 growing young men. In this episode, Mike's going to share with us his cross-cultural experiences at home and abroad, his views on the demonstrations, and his early affection for Black athletes.
Well, for me, for some reason, at a very young age, so I didn't grow up around a lot of people who are Black, just weren't a lot in my environment.
Where'd you grow up?
The first in Regina, Saskatchewan.
Right on.
But wherever they were in my life, it was always like they were like either the talented artist musically, or they're especially athletic. Like that was the world I grew up in. I was a fan of sports. I don't know, instantly so as soon as I'm reading about sports. And so, Saskatchewan Roughriders are a football team in a province that, doesn't have a whole lot of people who are, it's changed big time now. Mm-hmm. But at the time, but they were all heroes, community heroes. They were all like, So there was that. And then there was the odd time there'd be a Black student in one of the high schools. So when I got to high school, so my junior high school, I'm really into basketball. I love basketball, everything about basketball. So everything I can get from the U.S. about basketball, Sports Illustrated, it's full of talented Black athletes, and they seem to be even stronger than the white athletes, just from a kid's perspective. I'm just telling you what it felt like. No one taught me that or anything like that. I'm just reading it, and I don't know if anyone would consider Sports Illustrated race conscious in its writing and all that kind of thing. But I learned early that was something that was going on in the States that people had to face, but I just thought, wow, they're good at everything. That's what it looked like to me, like it was perception, because I didn't know that many, right, in real life. And the few, I remember some players from a particular high school that were twins growing up, and they were 2 years older than me. I don't know if they're twins or just close in age, but these brothers, all the girls loved them. They were good looking. They were good at basketball. I remember I took a charge once. One of them drove right into me, and he was just like, they were all that. They were just all that. So for me, it was like a positive thing, and I never actually heard anyone say anything about them, even around me, that was like a negative thing.
Interesting.
I just didn't. It could have happened. I'm sure if I sat down with them, they'd say, "Oh, it happened to me in Regina for sure." So I'm not saying those things didn't exist. Maybe I was in a sheltered thing, or what. Your experience is a little different than a lot of people's too. So, but the thing that gradually was more. So I had a First Nations brother and sister.
Okay. And
they grew up with me since they were babies. So. I didn't think of them as different, and my parents used to always teach them like great things about First Nations culture. So while we're all sitting there talking about our family backgrounds, my parents would say, "Oh, this is your family, and this was a really good thing about you," and they pumped them up about this sort of thing as best they could. I think nowadays there's better tools for that, but my parents did the best they could. But what I didn't realize is that we were going to the same school, the same churches, the same everything. And I didn't realize that they were getting a different kind of treatment. So it wasn't until I got to college and I took a course in independent study just on, how the treaties were signed and the experience of First Nations in Canada. I had no idea about all that stuff. Like in social studies in those days, what you learned about First Nations was just this idyllic, romantic world of them, the hunting techniques and community, and that's it. Like the modern experience and what all the negative stuff that happened and the impact of a colonial, you know, agenda and all that. No discussion about that really at all. So in college, my eyes were just like, I was shocked by that and heartbroken. And then at the same time as we had a sort of a program where a bunch of young people would go out from our college and do some programs for children that were just kind of running around some of the poor areas in Regina, and it would just break our hearts to see some of the situations that some of them were going through. So all of a sudden I realized this stark contrast between First Nations and white. And at the time, I still didn't know if I processed it well, but I was just shocked. And then I remember going to my brother and sister and going, what? Did people ever? Oh yeah, and the other thing is I worked in a department store where, you know, they said, you know, we can't be racist here. It was part of the intake process.
Right.
And then they proceeded to follow First Nations people when they came in the store, like to alert one another through these walkie-talkies. You know, there's some Indigenous persons come in the store, and weren't using nice words about it either. And we had to follow them. And I was kind of, I thought this was the thing. So I only worked there for a while, but I remember this being, so I remember going to my brother and saying, do you get followed when you go into a store? You know, and he was like, all the time. And it just, him saying that, and he never complained, and he just acted like, well, yeah, of course, you know, and I was just floored that anyone would follow. Like my brother is like, just to think that anyone would immediately think of him as a thief. It crushed me on the inside.
That's awesome that you thought all black people were amazing. I want to say that there off the top. When did that change, or what caused you to realize that, you know, not all black people were sports figures or whatever?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my world consciousness grew, especially with a trip. And for me, it was kind of like you, it was a trip to West Africa. I did that after 2 years of being at a pastor training school, Bible college. I lived 4 months in Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. And that really shook me. Like, it made me realize that, you know, I had a very sheltered, fairly white suburban experience, like many Canadians, but I just did not know about cultural diversity. I didn't know much about culture shock. I didn't know, so I was there long enough to go through that period where you think everything's amazing, and then a period where you think some of the people in the cultural practices are crazy, and culture, and then, you know, just, you know, feeling superior, feeling more wealthy, and then guilty, and there's just a whole bunch of things you go through. And in the midst of it, you start to build friendships, trust to start to build with certain people, and you realize that in amidst all these layers, you're just one, like your culture and your way of life is just one small blip. And there's this huge pantheon of amazing people out there, and you start to get a handle on seeing yourself small. But it was a beginning. And it was just like I wouldn't have arrived at some point of maturity, but boy, I came back all feeling worldly wise and all that kind of thing. But even looking back, I'm sure I said lots of things that were like kind of, I don't know. I think I still had tons to learn, but it really cracked open my naturally narrow way of seeing the world as a Christian, as a white, you know, kid from the prairies. It was just amazing to see all these people in different cultures, because Côte d'Ivoire, just like Ghana, you know, diverse, lots of different tribes, lots of different peoples. They don't see themselves as one people. Like, I remember one time they were arguing with me. They said, Michael is how my name would come out, and they're like, Michael, and they would say you're American, and I'd say no, I'm not American, I'm Canadian, and they would say, this is all in French, but they say it's all the same. It's all the same, like Canadian, American, and I say, and like the country next door, that one of the borders is Ghana, and I knew some of there's migrant workers sometimes that would come from Ghana and work in Ivory Coast, and
Right.
I'd say, oh, it'd just be like saying you're the same as a Ghanaian, and they'd be like, whoa, are you crazy? It was just like I said something. It was like they were like, you just said the dumbest thing you could ever say in the world. Like, so they don't see themselves as the same as one another. There's like dramatic differences there, and that to me was a great lesson, a great learning, and yeah. So difference made me, and not to see anybody as one type, but stereotypes. My experience with being people from Africa did weigh on me. So when I met Africans later, I would think about my earlier experience instead of allowing the fresh experience to be fresh.
Right.
And those prejudgments and that entered into it later as I was a pastor. I remember that you can put a box on somebody and think you're just like these people that I met before. I remember I had to catch myself doing that. I felt completely brutal, but it was a reality. It's something I had to go through. I had to go and say I was sorry to somebody. And
Huh. So you grew up. What church did you grow up in?
it was Christian Missionary Alliance, same denomination. Yeah.
Okay. So with regards to the denomination, missions is definitely a big focus.
Yep.
So what was like how was that presented to you when it came to speaking of the nations and that sort of thing? What
Well,
was that
and I
like?
think it does in on the positive side, it predisposes you to thinking that all these people, like the theological baseline that did get through to me, that was a positive thing, was that all people matter to God. That was crystal clear in my particular tradition, and in our college in particular. At the time that I was there, the kind of teaching that was there was that the people that would come from different cultures, they didn't denounce them. They didn't act like these people are terrible people and we need to go help them and fix them or anything like that. It was very much the sense of that these people matter to God. And the reason we do anything is because they're so valuable to Him. And the idea on the theoretical level when it comes to church planting or evangelism was very geared around the sense of local leadership, local training. Canadians should not run things. They should only be, there to, and there's still cultural, anyone would say, well, there's still, as soon as the cultures interact, there's issues of power and wealth and stuff at play. But I'm just saying that there was a positive baseline too, which was the sense that there was something to be gained and learned. And so anybody that came and spoke would say, let me tell you something beautiful about these people from Argentina. Or let me tell you something beautiful about, you got the sense that cultures had something beautiful to bring. And so that was built into the theory of it. But their experience of it, to know that your world was still rather small, it took the trip to really bring that home, and still a lifetime of interaction. I would say that the majority of my education still, whatever the theory was, has been in real relationship with people who are different from me. That is many times better than someone saying this is how you should treat people.
Right.
And learning about racial differences amongst other countries, that was also huge. Like that this culture looks down on this culture. Like that these things happen all over the world. Like that's in the Bible too, between the Jewish heritage and the Greek heritage and the Gentile heritage and all this kind of thing. That definitely was true in Cote d'Ivoire. There was people, there's different tribes that did not connect with each other.
Yeah.
The reaching out to people from a Muslim background, that was a scandal. That was a difficult thing for people to imagine, from one group to another. So I was aware of that. So then it's sort of like, then I started to see it, learn about it in Canada much later as an adult. I lived an idyllic world that basically I thought, things like the civil rights and all that, those were all in the old days. I think my mom did once tell me this funny thing that she said that one time in high school, I think she dated, someone who was black. And so that this was a bit like a big scandal, but she didn't tell me what happened. Like, what's the whole story behind that? Like, maybe I'd like to interview her and say, what was that? What was that like to be, that would have been in the 1960s and, in New York. So what was that like for her to go through that experience? I don't know. But she always had a smirk about it. Like it was like she enjoyed the whole dating thing. but that it was a big thing. But to me, that's what it felt like. That's those are a million years ago. My mom, my parents.
They're old. Yeah, they're
Parents
old
are so old.
Yeah.
In the old days, this is what they thought. Finding out later and finding out now, that my Canada had a hard time with race and especially with the First Nations and stuff. That stuff was more of a shock to me. I didn't realize what that was like, and so getting to know some friends. There was one First Nations kind of pastor who became a theologian, and man, I could just sit and listen to him, and there were so many things that he said that just helped open my eyes, and things that I thought I knew that I just didn't really know. And so that was very formative for me, for sure.
So as you hear about, what's happening, so George Floyd, and, what's your response to, not response, like what is your action to it, but what, when you hear about it, like what goes on, like in you when you say it?
Yeah. Well, what rises up in me is because of, the experience of being, particularly the years that I was pastoring at Eastgate, helped shape. It made me help me understand what the Bible teaches about the nations being reconciled under Christ, so that the church is meant to be an example of relationships being reconciled that are cross-cultural, basically. That's what's supposed to happen. It made me realize how hard that is for really to happen too, because I watched as people interacted and, to share resources, share rooms, share, ministry strategies, share, all that sharing, your cultural differences start to clash. And just watching that happen but knowing how beautiful it is when it happens, that's really deep to me. Like my grandfather gave me a great sort of theological background, but my heart in terms of getting excited about church ministry, it comes from broken relationships getting restored, like that, all the potential of that.
Right.
And God basically wanting to show off to the cosmos that, look, I can take what's meant to be, what people think is going to be hostile, and put it together. So what rises up within me is the opposite of excitement. I just feel absolutely terrible because I see this is horrible. And the way it drags the name of Jesus through the mud, because the very thing that's like ancient, going back to first century, this ancient thing called the church which is, even goes back to the Abraham being, God saying, you're going to bless the nations through you. Like this whole idea of blessing the nations and it being tarnished by people who would call themselves Christians. It just makes me feel absolutely sick, and it makes me say, why, God, how can you let this happen? It's just the same as how I felt with the residential school thing when I found out about it, the First Nations. Like, these are people that felt like they were doing this with God's blessing, and it just breaks my heart. So I just to think there's someone out there that thinks that, that mistreatment is somehow justified, I remember reading in Bible college too, I think there was a Mark Twain story it was two people talking about the Civil War, and both kind of saying that their side was blessed by God, and that was my first. See, that whole Civil War thing is huge for the Americans, right?
Absolutely.
Of course, in Canada, we don't talk about it. We don't even know about it. Like, we have to learn the story, and that narrative is weaved into the American story quite profoundly. I've learned a lot more about that in these last few years, and it makes you realize modern politics and the Civil War are deeply intertwined, and so that grieves me. Just grieves me to no end that anyone would feel alienated, or that anyone would see me as I now represent whiteness and hatred. And I remember reading that book by Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, yeah.
Ta-Nehisi Coates. I don't know how to say his name properly. That book, we were 8 years in power, and just reading about how he views that the white people are like actively working against, right? And just the thing that I would be lumped in with that. And the curiosity, am I somehow lumped into something that's working against anybody? And I feel like it's a deep and penetrating question, and it requires friendship, it requires discussion, which is why we're doing this. we were going to do it anyways, but we may as well do it with because of the end goal for me isn't that people would see me as virtuous, because I don't think I'm on a path hopefully towards virtue, but I don't. It's not the goal. The goal for me is I really do think that there's some visual demonstration of friendship and love that's meant to be seen in the church, that the church should model and also exhibit for people who aren't in the church. That they should be experiencing it wherever a Christian is. A kind of affection, an openness, a kindness, an agent that says wherever there's that kind of racializing of a situation, say, oh, that's antithetical to my faith, kind of thing. And so so when I hear a story of someone being mistreated, whether it's from your background or for anyone else's, you just feel sick, because it's like that's the opposite of what should be happening.
So in light of what's happened since George Floyd, like, what would your, I guess, comment or your view would be on these demonstrations? Like, does it say anything to you about, like, God? Does it say anything to you about just we've had it? Like, does it?
Well,
what does it do anything?
I guess I would, in an ideal world, you don't want anyone to be burning anything and all that kind of thing. But the first feeling you have is, you see why I understand why people are upset. Like, I understand that. It's not that it justifies anything. I just think I understand that the anger is real, and the sense of injustice, and sadly it's not the first time these things have happened through history, where people are feel like violence. Now violence does breed more violence, so it can't be like this won't get solved through violence. Absolutely, no one thinks that it will be solved through violence, but man, I see it, and I understand. Like, when I say I understand, obviously I don't mean perfect understanding, but it makes sense why it would happen. The weird thing about the social media, and we'll have to talk about that at some point, but it kind of blankets everyone into the same boat, and it's not. We're not all in the same boat. We're not all on the same exact page, but we're all experiencing the same story. There is a narrative that we're all sharing. And it's hard, I think, to unpack those two things. But I want to be clear in my own context that what we think is wrong, so that no one accidentally thinks somehow we're gonna, I don't know what you call it. Like, there's no way that racism is, like, what do you call it, justified or anything like that. And people need to know, just in case someone needed to know. You sort of need to make sure that these things are clear. And I think the whole general posture that people are saying about listening, I think that's really important. I think the other thing that I feel, though, all the time is the polarization of dialogue, where people jump on each other's worst and really demonize and pillarize, like, anything that's slightly off message or seems like, just without any relationship, without any context, just someone's tweet or someone's comment, or it's like, I feel like it's the worst way for, like, so there's like 30% really good that can happen through social media. I don't know what it is for you. Maybe the percentage would be 50-50, or I feel like the 20% that's a really good 20% is amazing on the social media. And then I think there's 80% that's also destroying dialogue and causing people to retreat into, like, packs of mobs that are just ready to destroy each other. And so I feel like there's a regression, and part of it is the means we use to communicate are worse. But the 20% includes how the video even gets out there, so people know that bad things like this happen and can increase the dialogue. That part, someone could say, well, I totally agree. Like, that's a positive, right? I can't deny that, for sure. That just having someone show the video so you can see it. People would say it's getting like Will Smith, and you say it's something like it's always been happening, and now it's getting filmed. And I think there's real truth to that. So I don't get to pick either or anyways. It just is, right?
Just is.
But I think the danger that the people have in terms of like sort of destroying each other verbally, as opposed to that part I know is, I just know from Proverbs that it's not gonna increase the opportunity for people to speak. So wherever there has been positive dialogue, I think it's great.
So almost you need those voices amplified, almost some of that, the positive.
Yeah,
stories,
I do think that's a huge part of it. I don't think it's a war between the positive and the negative. It's just that what's going to get lost is like I totally think that there's people like that. The guy who's featured in the movie Just Mercy. If you just track the different things he's been involved in, the kind of dialogues that he's fostered, I think different police outfits in different cities would be having different experiences where there's places where they've decided to dive in on the race dialogue and do a better job at hiring affirmative practices and all this kind of thing. Like wherever there's been good work, I'd hate for people to say, well, nothing's changed. If in those situations, whether it's in this community or that community or this community, where it's like, no, wait, in this place, in this particular town or village or wherever, the police are sitting down with community leaders and talking about things, and they're not all, and then this other place it's negative, it's regressed. But one of the things that's hard to do in social media is like it's like just blankets everything. So I hope that there can be an appreciation. That's where the local stories of positivity need to come out, and the negativity, there's just something about context that does matter. And one wrong is always wrong, and when you see it, you got to call it out, and it's infuriating. But man, we do need some riots that celebrate. So, so when some victories happen and some really amazingly cool things happen, that those can somehow get the same kind of passionate attention.